The modern-day minstrels write and sing of time in ways as varied as that even more powerful human experience, love. In my music library, one singer-songwriter bemoans the state wherein they have too much of it on their hands, while another complains of there never being enough. For some, time flies, and for others, it crawls. For those who have, for reasons motivated by jealousy or revenge, crossed the lines drawn by society, time is hard done. There are the best of times, the first time, the last time, prime time, and of course, the right time. Some sing of all this time, to signify that which outlasts human record. Others tell that times are a-changing, to proclaim that old ways of seeing the world are passing away. And still more, rail against there never being enough time to accomplish that which is most important in a person's life. The one metaphor, though, found more often than any other, is that time flows. Whether this is thought to be like sand through an hourglass, or a river that seeks the sea, time is represented as this thing continuous and inexorably moving forward, not to a specific destination, but in a fixed direction, unchanging and unstoppable. When one expands this consideration of time to literary and media sources, the metaphor of a river and the motions and characteristics found associated with the flow of water are also common. Many a science fiction film finds the characters caught in eddies, whirls, and vortices from which they must be extracted or face an eternity of repetition. This is not the only picture of time, though. There are many peoples, ancient and not so ancient, who have compared time and its passage to the weaving of a tapestry, many threads from several sources intertwining to form the complex cascade of events. It was the Greeks who said that it was the Moirai who spun the threads of destiny that advanced time. It was Ariadne who hailed the thread that led Theseus to the center of the Minoan labyrinth before being claimed by the god Dionysus. In our episode on the astronomy of the native peoples of South America, we discussed the temple of a tribe where the light of the sun was said to weave together the passage of time along the floor of the structure between the temple's ritual hearths. Each of these different expressions of time expose the reality that while we may have many metaphors for it, the diversity of those representations make it clear that we don't exactly have a good handle on what it is. In fact, I would imagine unless you've spent some time in the study of either relativistic physics or the philosophy of time, you might find it difficult to answer the question, what is time? As the 4th century Bishop of Hippo, Augustine, wrote in his Confessions, quote, "What then is time? If no one asks me, I know. If I wish to explain it, though, to the one that asks, I know not." End quote. Time is a tricky thing to consider, where one question leads to another, which leads to another after that. As we have discussed in the past 2 episodes, we claim to be able to measure time, but it's certainly not like measuring the volume of water or the mass of a piece of metal, things we can touch and see. Rather, it seems to be much more akin to measuring space, or conceptually like counting numbers that represent abstract quantities. In this episode and the next, I hope to introduce you to some of the ideas and perspectives in which philosophers, natural and otherwise, have thought about time over the years, and see where those musings lead us in our characterization of the natural universe today. Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a many-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery. Series 3, Finding Our Place. Episode 10.3, Supplemental. A Brief History of Telling Time, The Philosophy of Time, Part 1. So, when we talk about time, there's usually the sense that we have a pretty good handle on what we mean, until that very basic question Augustine mentioned gets asked. What is it? And then all of a sudden, we're at something of a loss. This is one of those types of philosophical questions that tend to drive people nuts, because it seems so obvious and so unnecessary, and yet, at the same time, so unanswerable. What we want to say is that there's this thing called time, goes forward, stuff happens, and time seems to keep it all in order. Why do we have to make it any more complicated than that? And that's a fair question, I suppose. From the perspective of a farmer, for example, as long as time can be measured well enough so that he can plant his crops at the right time, do the various things that help the crops grow healthy when he's supposed to, and then harvest a bountiful crop so that he and his family have enough to eat through the barren winter, then a picture of time is pretty much good enough. But if we think about it a little bit, the thing with the farmer isn't really as much about knowing what time is, as it is about knowing the cyclical nature of the Earth's seasons, and then regulating that to the measurement of something that we call time. It doesn't really tell us very much about the thing itself. For many, it doesn't even tell us if something like time even exists. I think that here recently, philosophy has gotten something of a bad reputation as sort of a self-indulgent intellectual exercise that doesn't make much difference in the lives of everyday people. In the sciences, especially in physics, there's a feeling among many prominent voices that philosophy as a method of inquiry is just a big waste of time. Now, as you might guess if you've been listening to this show for a while, I'm not among those people. For me, philosophy is a profoundly helpful thing in the doing of inquiry, because philosophy, when done well, helps us to ask the best kinds of questions. The kinds of questions that push us into seeking answers about how the universe really is. Now, are there times when philosophy doesn't do this? Sure. Every field of inquiry has its dead ends, wrong turns, and, times when it's chasing its own tail. That doesn't mean that the area of inquiry is a bad one, but rather that it's stuck, something that's happened in every field. In many ways, it is those who are best at being able to ask the most discerning questions that are the most successful in understanding the subjects they investigate. And I think that's why philosophy is so important to the sciences. So what about time? What are some good questions to help us understand its nature? Well, the first question we might ask is, does time even exist? Now, before you go sort of blow off the question and say, well, of course it exists. I've got a clock right here and it measures it. Let's think about the question for a minute. When we ask if time exists, it's not the same thing as asking if, say, a swallow, either African or European, exists. With a swallow, we could go out and look around and see if there are any to be found. If we find one or perhaps a pair, maybe carrying a coconut, then we can point at it and say, well, here you have it, the thing exists. If, on the other hand, we do a fairly comprehensive search around the lands of Europe and North Africa and find that there aren't any of these things, then we can conclude with a given level of confidence, depending on the diligence of our search, that such a thing is a figment of someone's imagination. A bit like what we used to call snipe hunts, that you may recall if you were ever spending any time in Scouts. A snipe hunt was where the older members of a troop on the first night of an outing would tell the newest members of the troop that there was this creature known as a snipe that could get caught if the searcher was quick and clever enough. And if the new members were both a bit gullible and eager to please the old members, they'd head off into the night with their flashlights and nets in search of the fictional creature, always to meet with failure in their attempts to locate it. In these examples, the existence of the thing can be determined by the finding of the thing. In other words, if you can get a sample of it, you know that it exists. Time, on the other hand, is a completely different category. It's not a thing like a swallow or the fictional snipe, nor is it a substance like its metaphorical counterpart water, which can be collected in a container and examined. Thus, if we answer the question of what is time with the answer, well, it's that which is measured by a clock, we run into the problem that the clock doesn't actually collect an amount of time. What's worse is that in trying to define time through a process of measurement, it sort of becomes a circular argument, in that the best we can say is that a clock measures time by dividing the amount of time between two similar events to happen, whether that be the dripping of water, the swinging of a pendulum, or, to return to our example of the farmer, the rotation of the earth on its axis. So already, we're in trouble trying to determine if time even exists. If, however, we assume it does, the next question might be, why do we think that there is this thing or substance? One analogy we might use to think of this is if we think of ourselves, say, as a fish in a pond. One day, one particularly inquisitive fish might say to the fish around him or her, "I think we're all moving through the substance called water," to which the other fish might ask, "Why do you think that?" Now, as an aside here, I want you to notice that these sorts of philosophical questions are good ones to ask. In the case of the fish, these are good questions for a fish to ask because they lead the fish to better understand the world they live in, and perhaps it gives them a chance to improve their lives either by being able to modify their environment, i.e. by creating a technology that makes the water better for them in some way, or by giving them a deeper and more comprehensive understanding of their fishiness, thus presumably allowing them to have a more full and appropriate appreciation of their uniquely fish-like experience. So, in the same way, and perhaps for the same reasons, why do we think that there's this thing called time if somebody says, "Hey, we're all moving through this thing called time"? The first reason most people agree upon is that events happen in some kind of an order. When we look at a series of events, we can't understand them completely just by looking at them randomly. Rather, we think we can gain a better understanding of the events and their relationships with each other by considering them in the order in which they occurred. The second reason we tend to think that time exists is that we think of events as changing in some way in relationship to us. We can think of an event that will take place in the future, and then is coming to be, and then passing by and being in the past. A great example of this might be the launch of a rocket that will carry a new GPS satellite into orbit so that your phone will be better able to locate your position in space. Prior to the launch of the rocket, we will count down in some agreed upon units of measurement until we reach 0, when the ignition of the rocket occurs. And then we will count upward, indicating the time after the launch has happened. Now, some of you might have just noticed that I did a little sleight of hand just now. Or perhaps I should say, a sleight of mind. When I talked about the second reason of why we think that there's this thing called time, I referenced an event moving in relation to us. But in the rocket example I used, I spoke about the rocket launch as if it were the stationary thing, and that our perspective with respect to it was the thing that was changing. It turns out, of course, that they're really the same thing, because saying that the launch of the rocket is 1 minute ahead for us is the same thing as saying that we're 1 minute behind or before the launch from the perspective of the time of the launch. This sort of thing is known as relativity, and can be done with both space and time. It is the way in which we can relate the location of an event, either in space or time, from the perspective of an observer in what we call a reference frame. From the perspective of an observer, in the control room at the T-1 minute mark, the launch is 1 minute in the future of now time and is moving towards that now moment. For an observer at the instant of the launch, though, the T-1 minute mark would be 1 minute in the past relative to the launch's now, and moving away. The moment in time can be expressed in each frame of reference relative to each other if the relative time relationship between the two frames is known. While this short digression into relativity isn't necessarily all that important to our discussion of why we think there's something like time, it will become important to the modern way in which we characterize it down the ways in the next episode. And so I thought it'd be a good thing to introduce it now so that you can let it simmer on the back burner until we need it again. Okay, so to review, we're not sure if this thing called time even exists, but 2 reasons we think that there might be something like time is that events happen in some sort of order, and that the relationship of an event with respect to our point of observation or frame of reference might move. In both of these arguments is the idea that the universe around us is changing in ways we can observe. However, there is something of a conundrum, or, dare I say, paradox, which can be found in these 2 observations. In the first, we think of events as being stationary, at least with respect to each other, once they are in the past. While in the second, we talk of them moving with relationship to an observer, say us. So are events static, or do they move, or is there some way in which both things can be true? The philosophical question might be, is there really something we call time that passes, or is time somehow just a subjective aspect of our human experience and not really a thing? Now this is a really good philosophical question, and it opens the door to a lot of other questions, such as, how do we experience time? Does time have a direction? Are both the future and the past set and immutable, or can they change or be changed? Does time have an origin? Is time linear, traveling in one direction at a constant rate, or is it cyclical? And of course, after asking all of these questions, one can ask, can we pause all the questions for a minute before my brain explodes and we have an ugly cleanup on aisle 3? Sure. Let's take a minute, catch our breath, and see if we can back up a little bit to questions that are a little bit easier to think about and answer. Okay, feel a bit better? World not spinning so much now? Good. Let's reset a bit by taking a look at the historical development of thinking about these kinds of things. As is usually the case, the place we tend to start with this is with the Greek philosophers. This isn't to say that they were the only ones to think about time, as there are long traditions of philosophical thought related to time and its perception in both Buddhism and Hinduism. We start with the Greeks because the Western tradition of looking at ideas from a rational perspective begins there. For the Greeks, the idea of time centers around the prospect or possibility of change. If there is change in the universe, then it seems that time, whatever it might be, has to be accounted for, because time is a part of how we characterize how something changes. If we think of something that moves, for example, say a car driving down the road in front of your house, it has to travel a certain distance in space in a given amount of duration of time. Another way to talk about this is to say that there is a change of position per amount of change of time, something we might call either speed or velocity, depending on whether the direction of travel is important. Now, it may seem pretty obvious to us that such things happen every day, but there was a school of Greek philosophical thought, the Eleatic school, so named because it was based in the Greek colony of Elea, which was located on the Italian coast, who said that change was an illusion, a trick played on our minds by our deceitful senses. By the way, did you just hear that last line in your internal dialogue Morpheus voice? Or is that just me? Maybe that's just me. Okay. The 2 most famous philosophers of the time to take this position were a man by the name of Parmenides and his student Zeno. By the way, if you listen to our episode on the philosophical atom, you will recall us discussing these guys then as well. So what were the arguments of the Eleatic school against the reality of change and thus the existence of time? The most commonly discussed arguments against change come from the writings of Zeno and are known as Zeno's paradoxes. The first is known as the dichotomy, and what it says that if you want to cover a distance, let's say it's the distance from your car to your front door upon arriving home from work or some other errand, there's a way that you have to do it. What Zeno says is that to cover that entire distance, you first travel half the distance, which will take you a finite amount of time. Then you must traverse half of the remaining distance, which again, he says, will take a finite amount of time. Now, having covered 3/4 of the way, you will have to cover half of the remaining quarter, again, taking some finite amount of time. Zeno says that this dividing the distance in half can be done an infinite number of times, and if each distance takes a finite time to cross, you will have an infinite number of distances, each requiring a finite time to travel, thus requiring an infinite amount of time to actually cross the distance. Now, since you seem to be able to walk from your car to the door of your home in a finite time, this raises a paradox. Zeno's second paradox is known as Achilles and the tortoise. In this one, Zeno imagines that the epic hero Brad Pitt has been placed into a foot race with the animal kingdom world champion, the tortoise, fresh off his sensational victory over the heavily favored hare. Now, in the interest of sporting fairness, though why anyone would make such a mistake after the debacle with the rabbit, the tortoise is given a somewhat substantial but not insurmountable head start. Zeno argues that as the race is run, in order to catch the tortoise, the extremely handsome and well-oiled Mr. Pitt must first run to the point where the hare began, let's say 50 meters. Of course, in this time, the hare will have traveled some distance towards the finish line and thus will still be ahead. In the next interval of time, Mr. Pitt, racing like he's being chased by zombies, will arrive at the point where the tortoise was, but again, the tortoise will have traveled forward. As in the case of our first paradox, this progression will continue, with Brad Pitt getting ever closer to the tortoise but never actually catching him. In fact, Zeno argues that even as the interval of the distance separating the two will grow smaller between them, our hero will only catch the tortoise after an infinite number of intervals, again suggesting an infinite amount of time must pass. Of course, as we know, Mr. Pitt, as would be the case for any of us, would run a simple 100-meter dash in much less time than any known tortoise species, even with a 50-meter head start, and thus we are once again faced with a paradox. Zeno combines these two paradoxes with one further paradox known as the arrow. Here, Zeno says that we should be able to know as a fact whether an arrow is in motion in the present now, not just as a fact about what it was doing in the past or what it will do in the future. However, if we observe it in a specific instant in time, the arrow only occupies the space equal to its shape and size. Zeno says that since these are properties that can only be known about objects at rest, the arrow must not be able to move, an argument that can be applied to any object. With these three paradoxes, Zeno follows his teacher in saying that all change and any quantities associated with that change, such as time and motion, are illusory. In the view of the Eleatic school of philosophy, there is no such thing as time, since there is no such thing as change. Now, if you find yourself in a car moving along at the legally mandated speed and unable to think of a way to contradict these three paradoxes, please do not stop acting so as to rationally control the motion of your vehicle. There are good counter-arguments in both philosophy and formal mathematics to Zeno's paradoxes, and thus you should go ahead and continue to assume that you are moving and that a relinquishing of the control of the vehicle may have rather disastrous results, as I can attest. The first counter-argument to the Eleatics comes from our old friend Aristotle. I mean, of course it does. Having listened to this podcast, who else would it come from? Well, okay, maybe it might have come from Democritus, but he was too busy at the time contradicting them on atomic theory, so it fell to our man, the teacher of Alexander the Great and the master of the Academy, Aristotle, to take up the task. Aristotle's teacher Plato had written in the Timaeus that time did exist and, in fact, was related to the motion of celestial bodies, claiming that if the sun, moon, and all the rest stopped moving in their courses through the heavens, time itself would cease. While Aristotle disagreed with this last bit, saying instead that as long as there was some form of motion anywhere in the universe, time would have to exist, it is still an important precedent, as it associates time with the motion of things in the universe. Aristotle expands on this by saying that since motion is, in its very existence, change, and that if it could happen at some given point in the universe, that it could happen, therefore, at any given point, then if change is possible in one place, the exact same time of change would be possible at all points in the universe. Now, the rate of that change may vary from one place to another, with an arrow flying swiftly to its target on the field of battle, while at the surface of a creek somewhere else a leaf might drift lazily along the current. This has to do with the change of the object's position in space. Therefore, Aristotle concluded that time must be the same in either case, and thus must be separate from change itself, therefore contradicting the Eleatic position that time and change were, in essence, the same thing. Aristotle's way of looking at time is a variation of what is known as relationalism, because in his view, time is how we relate something from what was before to what it is after. In this idea, time is not a thing or a substance or even a process. It's a relationship. Like a number, time relates one state to another without having to exist separately. For example, let's say I have a room with 2 chairs and another room with 3 chairs. While the rooms and chairs are things, the numbers that are used to quantify the chairs isn't another thing, substance, or process, but rather a way of telling which room has more or less of something, i.e. a way of describing a relationship. If I look into a room and I count 3 chairs, it's not that there are 3 chairs and another thing that I call 3. The 3 in the identification is a relationship describing quantity, i.e. more than 2 but less than 4. To treat the number as a thing would be to make the mistake of not understanding that numbers and chairs do not belong to the same types of objects. Thus, for Aristotle, the question becomes what type of relationship does time represent? In his writing, the relationship between change and time isn't one of identity, in other words, how are change and time alike or different, but instead between the thing measured, the change, and the means or type of number that is being used to measure it. In this sense, time is like the number in our chair example in that it represents, quote, the number of change with respect to before or after, unquote. If you think of pouring water into a vessel, if you had 2 cups of water earlier and then 3 cups later, the change in quantity is 1 cup, but there is also a change in the system from the state before to the state after that he associates with duration. Now, just as the difference in quantity is measured with respect to a standard unit, in this instance the cup, the duration could similarly be measured with respect to other events, ideally ones that repeat themselves regularly. But this is actually not a requirement for Aristotle's argument. The reason we don't have to have regular events is that to say that there is time, all we have to be able to do is give an account of the order of things in terms of before or after, just as we only have to say more or less to be able to say that there is an idea or relationship we might call quantity. In doing this, Aristotle is able to address Zeno's first 2 paradoxes by saying that the measurement of time is a quantity that is much more like a mathematical thing than a material one. This is the key idea because mathematical objects don't have to satisfy some of the requirements of real objects. Mathematical points, for example, don't have to take up space as they have 0 dimension. One can have an infinite number of points between any 2 points, just as one can think of there being an infinite number of fractional numbers between the numbers, say, 1 and 2 on a number line. Aristotle says that time, since, like numbers, describes a relationship and is mathematical in nature, it has these same sorts of properties. Thus, Zeno's infinite number of intervals can lead to an infinite number of durations. But since the durations don't have to take up some sort of material space, the total duration doesn't have to add up to an infinite value. What Zeno has done, Aristotle says, is to create paradoxes by confusing time and its mathematically abstract measurement and unit system with change, whether that be in volume or position in space, which is a real phenomenon that has to be measured in real physical units. In mathematics, this idea will be formally worked out with limit theory in the 17th century and onwards. However, there are some non-intuitive steps and associations one must make to do this, and then relate them to physical systems such as arrows and Brad Pitt and tortoises and that sort of thing. Because of this, it is Aristotle's arguments that more directly resolve the first two of Zeno's paradoxes through the use of reason. The arrow paradox is similarly resolved by Aristotle pointing out that Zeno is relying on the false premise that if time isn't an illusion, then it must be composed of instants. With his relational definition of time, Aristotle can say that motion can be a change in position over a non-zero duration, as is the case when we say miles per hour, meters per second, or cups per minute. Zeno's idea of an instant is that it has a duration of zero, so when he tries to invalidate motion and change, what he is really trying to say is that an object at rest travels zero distance in zero duration, or 0 meters in 0 seconds, something that doesn't make any sense. You can't divide 0 by 0. In actuality, an object at rest will travel zero distance in some finite duration, say 0 meters in 5 seconds or something. Again, Zeno's paradox results from trying to mix abstract time units and real physical change units, at least according to Aristotle. One additional benefit to Aristotle's approach here is that it uses only the tools of reasoning to arrive at its conclusions. He didn't do this because he thought that our perception of change was faulty. As we've discussed in previous episodes, Aristotle, as an empiricist, felt that all reliable information about our world came through our senses. He uses this approach because he knew that the Eleatic school, in its rejection of the reliability and trustworthiness of sense data, would also reject any arguments dependent upon them. It's pretty clever of Aristotle, actually. One place where Aristotle wasn't so clever, however, was in arguing against the objections of Zeno's teacher, Parmenides, to the existence of time and change. We've already touched on the ideas of Parmenides when we talked about how one relates past, present, and future in talking about time. When an item, say the flower of a rose bush, changes, it goes from being one thing in the past, say the unopened bud, to something in the present, a fully open and fragrant bloom, to something in the future, a faded and wilted collection of petals. When we consider either the unopened bud or the faded bloom, Parmenides is saying that we are considering or treating each as if it were real in the same way as we are doing in the present with the fragrant rose we are enjoying, say, with a loved one. However, if we treat something as if it was real, then it must be in the present now, and so, he claims, the past and future are really the same as now, and thus illusory. From this, Parmenides says we are then led into thinking all sorts of false things, such as describing things that aren't real because they don't exist at the present time as if they really are, and we end up creating a whole bunch of things out of nothing. The easiest way to think of these is to consider the case of the future. Let's say you're saving money for the future purchase of a particular make and model of a car. In doing this, you're treating the car as if it really existed, just like those cars you know exist in the now. However, that car in the future doesn't exist, and if the car company decides to stop producing that make and model next year, it will not exist when you get to that now. Moreover, by doing this, you are creating the car out of nothing as it doesn't exist now. Parmenides claims that your ability to do this shows that the idea of the future as you want to think of it doesn't exist, and thus time is illusory. Our deceptive senses, by lying to us about the reality of change, he says, creates a need for a time language to describe our limitations and what they force upon us. Now, before you go dismissing this out of hand, there are a number of philosophers who still ascribe to some version of this type of argument, even if they don't agree with Parmenides' denial of the reality of change. We actually have no guarantee that our senses give us a picture of the universe as it really is. The April 25th edition of the Eleatic has an article by Amanda Gefter, who interviews the prominent University of California at Irvine cognitive scientist Daniel Hoffman on just this sort of thing. Just because our senses lead us to believe that the world around us has to be a certain way, doesn't mean it actually really has to be like that. All our senses have to do is provide information that will allow us to survive in the world. If you think about it, there are all sorts of examples of this. I grew up thinking that tomatoes were a vegetable, just like the lettuce and celery that I usually ate with my salads. I know now, of course, that this is untrue, as tomatoes are actually fruit, more like apples and oranges. The misconception, however, that I had doesn't actually keep the tomato from being nutritious and good for me. As we will discuss, for thousands of years, farmers were either ignorant of a cosmological model of the sun's spatial relationship with the earth, or thought it was one with the earth at the center that had the sun traveling around it. Not knowing the true model didn't prevent them from developing a pretty accurate calendar for the planting and harvesting of crops. The argument here is that just because we get around in the universe doesn't mean that we can use that fact as an argument that our way of experiencing it must be an accurate description of how it really is. As long as the picture we develop from what our senses give us allows us to survive, that's good enough. What Parmenides would say is that our idea that there must be time is an example of this. In order to get around the world successfully based on what our senses are telling us, we have to invent mental models that have things like past and future in order to make sense of our limited and distorted perceptions, and thus have a better chance of getting around in it successfully. As author Adrian Bardon says in his book, A Brief History of the Philosophy of Time, quote, "The beliefs we need from a survival standpoint have to do with predicting what we will experience given what we are experiencing now and what actions we will take. It would be possible to be very successful at such predictions while still being quite in the dark as to whether the ways we categorize and contextualize our experiences actually reflect reality." Unquote. An example of this I can remember from an 8th grade science class I took as a kid had to do with a black box. We were in teams of 2, and so my friend Mike Odie and I were given a black box that was about the same size as a piece of paper that was oriented vertically, and it was about an inch thick. In the top of the box were 2 holes side by side that we could drop a marble into. We would hear the marble clunking its way through the box until it emerged either from the right or left-hand lower corner of the box. Our task was to develop a way of accurately predicting which hole the marble would come out of when dropped into one of the holes at the top. Of course, we weren't allowed to open the box up. Mike and I worked on this, as did the rest of the class, for a couple of days. We did a lot of tests, and at some point, fairly early on, we started recording our data. What was interesting was that Mike was able to come up with a table that was able to predict the outcome that he then turned into sort of a mathematical function. I, on the other hand, working in tandem, built a picture in my head of a series of ramps and switches inside the box that would be able to direct the motion of the marble, but that would also be changed by it. When we compared notes, it turned out that my physical model would create Mike's table and mathematical relationship. As we sort of argued as to which one was right, the teacher came over and asked us to explain what we were doing. When we did, he very helpfully pointed out that in a way we were both right because both of our models gave accurate predictions of the future outcomes. Mike's table told us nothing about the actual physical system, but it always worked. My physical model, while creative and, if I do say so myself, rather ingenious, may or may not have been what was going on inside of the box, though I contend that the sounds that the box made as the marble moved through it were a dead giveaway. But it also gave the correct answer. As long as we did that, we could quote-unquote survive the test. But what we couldn't do, and what we hadn't definitively done was figure out the nature of the reality inside the box. To relate this quaint little story back to our topic, Parmenides was saying that to create time was a bit like me creating ramps and levers to account for the behavior we saw. He went further to say that the perceived data was also misleading, but it created the same sort of thing. His idea was to throw out the idea of time completely and just accept that there was only one unchanging now. So what's the response to this? Well, here, Aristotle sort of dodges the question. In response, Aristotle says that to resolve the issues Parmenides brings up, you have to distinguish between different types of change. He first attacks Parmenides' idea that for something to exist in the future, it had to come from nothing. What Aristotle says here is that while yes, there could be a type of change of nothingness to not nothingness, there could also be a type of change where things that already existed just got changed in form and or arrangement. In other words, the car you want to buy in the future doesn't just poof into existence out of nothing by some arcane process in the car factory, but rather already existing things are modified and reformed into new forms and put together to make a car out of what already exists. He points out that cars that you owned in the past didn't just poof out of existence, but were also changed into other forms of things over time. This actually is a really good argument to one part of Parmenides' objection to change, but it doesn't really address the main point about the relationship of the past, present, and future. The future and past can't be real in the same way that the present is, and so how do things pass from the future to the present to the past? Aristotle doesn't really address that. For me, third-rate philosopher that I am, I might argue that the future we are planning for doesn't have to exist in reality the same way that the present does, but rather only in our imaginations, which form and work off of our experience from reality. Of course, then Parmenides would probably ask me something like, then how does the unreality of the future become the reality of the present? To this, I might want to talk about possibilities and the like, but then, maybe we should save those things for next week and the writings of some real philosophers. The last person I'd like to cover in this episode is Augustine of Hippo, who wrote extensively on time in his work Confessions. Augustine, or Saint Augustine as he is known in much of the world, was a North African of Berber descent who grew up in the late Greco-Roman period of the 5th century. Initially an atheist, he would convert to Christianity, and under the tutelage of Ambrose of Milan, would grow to become one of the most influential thinkers in the history of Christianity. His work, Confessions, chronicles his personal journey of faith, but it also attempts to explain the Christian God with a powerful blend of theology, cosmology, and strong philosophical arguments about time and memory. One of the theological issues he is trying to sort out is how his faith can speak of an eternal God, a theological position that had been adopted at earlier church councils. Associated with this were questions like, what was God doing before he created the universe? And, if nothing existed prior to the universe's creation but God, then why create the universe at one particular time instead of another? This second question is strongly related to the idea of change, as it suggests that God was what God was before some given moment, but then something about God changed, which led him to create the universe. Why would an eternal and perfect being want or need to change? By the way, these are still questions I hear not infrequently from some of the college students with whom I've had discussions regarding religion. I find this a source of great optimism, as it means, at least to me, that there are still minds willing to engage in inquiry on many levels. Now, getting them to decide to read Augustine and other theologians/philosophers, that's another matter. The way Augustine decides to go about this is to adopt, in some sense, the approach of Parmenides, something known as idealism. He starts by saying, quote, "Of these three divisions of time, past, present, and future, then, how can two, the past and present, be when the past no longer is and the future is not yet? As for the present, if it were always the present and never moved on to become the past, it would not be time, but eternity. If, therefore, the present is time only because it moves on to the past, how can we say that even the present is, when the reason why it is that it is not to be?" Unquote. Here we see the similarity to Parmenides in that the past and present aren't real because they aren't now, and thus don't exist. There's also an issue that when we talk about durations of time, the present duration is infinitely divisible into smaller and smaller present chunks. In other words, we can talk about the present day, today, but if we think about it, some of that is in the past and some of it's in the future. We can divide the day into an hour by saying this present hour, but again, part of that hour is in the past and another part of it is in the future. And this can go on, of course. So we are aware of extended periods of time beyond the present instant, and we're able to compare them with our present experience, which sort of gives you a sense that there is time. So, how do we measure time? If there is no time, but we're still able to measure it, how then do we actually resolve the paradox? Augustine's answer is that time, at least in how we measure it, exists only as a product of our minds. In this construction, past, present, and future become memory, sensation, and anticipation, which are able to leave mental impressions on us. Memory and anticipation, therefore, give our experience a temporal aspect rather than a perception of some actual change in the universe. As such, time is a human invention that is only relevant to human experience, but not applicable to either the universe or, most importantly, to Augustine's theology anyway, God. These rather exist in that timeless Augustinian state called eternity. Now, this is a brilliant way of creating idealism so that it doesn't require that our senses be completely faulty, and it addresses all of Aristotle's objections to both the Zeno and Parmenides. However, it's not without issues of its own. First, it sort of ignores the question of how we even come to have concepts like past and future if we never actually experience them. In other words, if these are constructs of the mind, how do we know how to create the constructs in the first place? Another question has to do with if the past is just a construction of our mind, how could there be a differing account of the past? In other words, in the story I told you about the black box science experiment I did as a student, let's say you went out and tracked down the records that the teacher kept and found out that in the records, my lab partner was not Mike Odie, but instead a different friend of mine by the name of Richard Hall. Now, which is true, my memory or the record? Augustine says that the past is a product of my memory, and yet you have found a record that contradicts this. We would, of course, be likely to suggest that the official record of the account is true, but then that calls into question whether there is a past that exists only in my memory, or if instead the past actually exists outside of that in some absolute sense. If documented, it seems pretty clear that there is a past that exists independently outside of my mind that may be significantly more accurate than what my mind has constructed. Another issue is that I can't for the life of me remember the name of the teacher of that class. Since I don't remember it, does that mean that the teacher was just some faceless entity, that he didn't exist? Again, most of us would reject this sort of thinking, choosing instead to assert that there was some real person with a real name and a real life who had the insight to make a few well-placed comments to help Mike and I understand something new about the nature of science. Or was it Mike and I? Now, if you're like me at this point, your head might be spinning just a bit. And if your head's not spinning a bit, and like Neo, you want more information to be fed into your noggin, you're probably a philosopher. And I'm sorry, there's no cure for that. You're doomed to spend the rest of your life posing and then thinking about things like, what is time? What is knowledge? And what can we know? The best I can do is recommend that you head over to Stephen West's Philosophize This or Peter Adamson's History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps podcasts to find a way to help meet your philosophical Jones, as it were. Don't worry though, I'm not going to leave you hanging here. There's still a lot to be said about this topic, including the presently dominant third philosophical position on time, something called realism. We'll pick these up next week to take a look at where things go after Augustine. As we wrap up, thanks to all of you out there who have sent me your well wishes for a speedy recovery. My injuries are healing and I am getting around better, but breaking all that stuff still hurts, and so I'm still moving slower than I'd like. Given how things could have turned out, however, I'm very, very grateful to be back with you again this week. For those wanting to do something to help out, the best thing I and the podcast could receive from you, our faithful listeners, are some great reviews on whatever service you use to listen to. Whether it's iTunes, Google Play Music, TuneIn, whatever, it would be great to get some positive feedback on the show. Just one review about a week and a half ago in iTunes shot us up into the top 20 in the higher ed rankings on iTunes, which helped us get seen by a few more people than usual. Also, some of you have told me that you've let some various folks know on some forums about the show. Thanks a whole bunch for that. If you know someone who might enjoy our content, why not shoot them an email with a link to the show on your service and then invite them to give us a listen. Next week, we're going to pick up where we left off and take a look at the idea of time as it relates to space, either as a dimension or as what's known as an a priori concept. Until then, full sails on your journey.